This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
A few days ago, I did something huge. It's September 20th, 2024, and I'm here standing in the parking lot for the transportation department here, where I've worked for 11 years, and today is my last day driving a school bus full-time. So I've been producing Truths for 7 years while holding down this full-time job that I've held for 11 years. And it's been taxing, working 11-hour days, often 60 hours a week. And I'm leaving the bus barn in order to do Truths full-time. And then I had to go looking for health insurance, update my budget. I got a bill for my car insurance. Turns out it costs real money to sustain a human being. I already live on a tight budget. My friends sometimes make fun of me for it, but I keep the costs down so I can focus on what really matters. For 11 years, driving a school bus has provided the majority of my income, but it's also cost me a lot in the process. Time, stress, withdrawing from in-person ministry because I'm just too busy. Truce isn't produced by a conglomerate or a megachurch or nonprofit. It's an independent, listener-funded podcast produced by just me on a shoestring budget. And by the grace of God, it reaches thousands of people every month. That independence means that together, we can depart from party lines and find out the truth. I can cover stories that nobody else is covering. It also means that I'm jumping into the unknown without a safety net. I'm asking you listening right now, to help out. We're only about $20,000 away from my goal. I'm asking for 170 people to give $10 a month. That's like half of a cup of coffee a week. Give me just 1 year to demonstrate the difference it makes when an independent creator is fully funded. You can set up automatic checks through your bank to go to P.O. Box 3434, Jackson, Wyoming, 83001, or Venmo me at Truce Podcast. I can also do credit cards, Patreon, or PayPal. All the information is at trucepodcast.com/donate. Please don't wait for somebody else to cover you. I know that $10 a month adds up and you're probably driving or doing dishes right now and think you're too busy to help. If you're ever going to give to a show, let it be this one, and let it be today. Let's prove that Christian media can be so much more than opinion and culture wars. It can have real impact. The website again is trucepodcast.com/donate. And you're about to listen to an episode that I am really excited about. It's something you're not going to hear on any other Christian podcast or any secular podcast. And seriously, if you like it and you want more content like this, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Okay, here comes the show. This is the second episode on the National Women's Conference of 1977. You're going to want to hear the previous 2 episodes before starting this one, including the one on Phyllis Schlafly. This episode is part of a whole season exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. This one might not be appropriate for young listeners. In Houston, Texas, inside of a national convention, reporters fanned out through the crowds, gathering audio perspectives from over 500 people. This was the National Women's Conference, held November 18th through the 21st, 1977. Here's some audio from a woman you may be familiar with. The audio isn't great.
Is that my daughter, who is now in law school, feels that all doors are open to her, that there are no barriers, there are no constraints.
I normally wouldn't use such rough audio, but this is a big name.
Would you tell me your name, address, telephone, that kind of data?
I'm Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, future Supreme Court Justice of the United States. At this event, there were also celebrities present.
On Saturday, when the resolution regarding ERA was passed, I felt like I was being a part of history, and I cherish that experience.
Did you join in the jubilation?
Oh, yes.
The woman being interviewed is the actress Jean Stapleton, most famous today for having played Edith Bunker on the hit TV show All in the Family.
Now, I must say that I didn't think that could be topped, but on Sunday, that feeling was topped when the passage of the substitute resolution for minority women was passed. I was on the floor then, and I joined in this wonderful celebration where all the minority women and the majority women joined hands and moved about the auditorium and sang. I can't describe. Thrilling. It was a real and spontaneous coming together. It was true sisterhood.
The conference hosted tens of thousands of women, talks, demonstrations. 1,440 delegates from all over the United States brought forward resolutions ranging from things like passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, to those addressing issues in the workplace. Women broke into song. They hugged. But there were protests, too. And odd appearances of people I wouldn't have expected. Here's an interview with somebody we touched on earlier this season.
I don't know if you really want to speak for other Christians, but in reaction to the demonstrations outside, the demonstrations against this conference by other people outside claiming to be messengers of God, can you talk about that a little bit and how a Christian man feels about women?
Already a loaded question given the setting, but let's keep going.
Well, I don't think that the people whom I saw outside this hall could be considered representative of any large body of Christians.
Those outside the hall caused a ruckus. People from unsavory groups ranging from the KKK to the John Birch Society made their presence known outside the venue. Banners reading terrible things, and I'm going to read it here, so pardon the terrible language, but it helps with context. Quote, "Who needs Jews, dykes, abortion," spelled wrong, and communism, end quote. Then there were members of the Christian Defense League who argued that Jews were not God's chosen people, but white Christians are, and that a cabal of Jewish bankers controlled the world. So when this man speaks about Christians outside not representing all Christians, or even all Christians in the region, he's actually right. The nuts showed up, and as sometimes happens, the media obliged with coverage.
I'm speaking about outside of this building and outside of the music fair that I saw. Now, the meeting that took place, I think, Friday or Saturday at the Astrodome may have been more representative of some of that concern.
When far-right conservatives were not invited to the table in the president's commission that planned the National Women's Conference, as we covered in the last episode, the far-right fought back, disrupting meetings, flooding state conferences, hoping to stack the delegations to the national meeting with their people. When that didn't work, they were left wondering how they should move forward. Their answer? Hold their own meeting just down the road. Nothing about this season moves in a straight line. I still haven't told you who this man is, the one who was talking about the Christian presence at the conference. This is the voice of a leader from the Black Panther Party. In the coming years, he'd join the LDS Church. He was a Republican, and his name was Eldridge Cleaver. For those of you who've managed to make it this far in this season, his name may sound familiar. I read selections of his book, Soul on Ice, in the episodes about the Kanawha County textbook war, which happened just 3 years earlier in West Virginia. In that school district, his book was protested because he wrote about his experiences as a young man revenge-raping white women, something he later repented for. This is that same guy. His book was one of the things that caused that big uproar. And here he is at this national convention for women, talking about Christians. Take the elation felt by Jean Stapleton, the sense of sisterhood, and juxtapose that with what Eldridge Cleaver saw. To cover the National Women's Conference is to see both, and to see a mirror image of that as religious people across town experienced euphoria. This weekend in 1977 was the culmination of years of work. It brought together the people of a nation, and then split them apart, deepened divides, ultimately creating the pro-family movement. This is a story rarely told in discussions about the formation of the religious right. And why? Well, I only really have guesses. I think it's because the story is messy, and it's about women, which doesn't really fit our narratives about how the religious right came to be. This is their story, about how a group of people, led by women, bonded together people from different faiths, and prepared the way for some evangelicals to tie themselves to the Republican Party. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. The conference was kicked off well before the delegates ever arrived in Houston. In September, a crowd gathered for the lighting of a torch in Seneca Falls, New York, the site of the first American Women's Rights Conference in 1848. The torch was carried 2,600 miles by celebrities, mayors, high school and college track teams, and expectant mothers, all the way to Houston. And when it arrived, it was greeted by dignitaries. First Ladies Rosalind Carter, Lady Bird Johnson, and Betty Ford were in attendance. 3 women of different races carried it the last mile, also delivering a copy of a poem written by Maya Angelou specifically for the occasion. There were lots of shenanigans, and we'll get to them. But before I mar the image of this event with all the drama, let's take a moment and appreciate the idea of bringing together women of all kinds in one building. Why? To listen, to vote in a democratic fashion, and to assemble proposals for the Congress and the president.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me say this, that...
This is Marjorie Spruill. She's the author of the fantastic book, Divided We Stand, that covers the National Women's Conference.
So in what they call the National Plan of Action, it was very sweeping. It basically included a lot of the moderate goals of the women who had gotten the women's movement started in the mid-1960s, as well as some of the goals that had been added by more radical and younger women who had come into the movement later.
The National Plan of Action covered everything from abortion to national health care, equal roles for women in government. They called for federally funded childcare, something that had almost passed, but was vetoed by President Nixon. All 26 proposals were passed except for one, which called for the creation of a cabinet-level position on women's issues. One leader of the movement said,
"The critics who said we could never all agree on anything, we have just proved them wrong."
One of the most shocking was, of course, when they approved this plank that they call the sexual preference plank that protected the rights of lesbians. And when that passed, the supporters were absolutely jubilant, and the conservatives turned their backs to the podium in protest and bowed their heads in prayer.
So here's a hard truth. For all the bluster and panic, the conservatives were actually right. The event was used to push alternative lifestyles. This was just a few months after Anita Bryant's crusade in Dade County, Florida, which was all over the news. Betty Friedan, who spoke in favor of the platform, knew this would give power to the religious right and perhaps eclipse other important work. Another plank that passed was the one that affirmed the rights of minority women. It was ironed out after an all-night gathering trying to get the language just right.
Coretta Scott King,
wife of slain civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr.,
read the final passage of it, and she read something that just gives me chill bumps. She said, "There is a new force, a new understanding, a new sisterhood against all injustice that has been born here. We will not be divided and defeated again."
Referring to the way that white feminists had distanced themselves from minorities in order to get the 19th Amendment passed.
Whether they were young radicals in T-shirts or elderly blue-haired ladies or whatever, people just sprang to their feet and linked arms and sang, "We shall overcome."
Yes, there were disturbances. The KKK made a stink. In speeches, Bella Abzug lumped them in with John Bircher's Stop ERA people and Mormons. A group of lesbians got into a fight with bigots outside the conference. But for all the buildup and all the noise, the National Women's Conference set the direction for the feminist movement for years to come. But with conservative women feeling ignored and opposing some of the planks of the National Plan of Action, the conference was in danger of being overshadowed, not by fistfights and protesters, but by another event held across town, the pro-family, pro-life rally. I'll continue the story after these messages. But while you're listening to the ads, why not post about the show on social media? If you'd like to hear more truths, tell a friend. Okay, here come the ads. you remember when... All right, so this is Chris. I'm outside Buffalo, Wyoming. I traveled across Wyoming to report on how the ultra-wealthy use tax breaks to drive poor people out of the state.
People, I don't think, see this as a labor uprising, which it was quite literally. The cowboys were on strike against the ownership.
Or had my small group pretend to run a taco truck to demonstrate inflation? So how many tacos do you have to sell?
I have to sell 500 tacos.
Soon I'll feature an interview I did with a Stanford professor about the economics of Milton Friedman.
They presented an analysis of the Great Depression that really laid the Great Depression at the feet of the Federal Reserve.
We'll have a roundtable discussion to understand women's books of the 1970s.
This is like the Girl Wash Your Face book of 1974.
Exactly. This is not your typical Christian podcast. Because I believe that audiences are intelligent, that the thing we need most in this troubled time is not simple answers, but to understand how we got here and how we can do better. And now, I'm taking a big leap of faith. I'm quitting my job driving a school bus so I can focus more of my energy on this show, because this material matters. I'm asking every listener to do 2 things. Tell your friends about the show and prayerfully consider giving $10 a month to make Truce sustainable. Nobody's getting rich here. I just need to pay my rent, health insurance, and grocery bills. $10 a month can make that dream a reality. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to help. Paying monthly by a check is the best option because it gets around all the banking fees. But I can also take credit card, PayPal, or Venmo me at Truce Podcast. There is so much good content heading your way. Together, let's invest in Christian media that calls us back to the gospel and helps us love and understand our neighbors. trucepodcast.com/donate. In the last episode, we discussed attempts by conservative women to block or overtake the National Women's Conference. Conservative women were dispatched to state meetings to take notes and report back on what they saw. Some of it was true. There were moves to add lesbian rights to the platform, and some of it was inflated.
And they were doing everything they could to stop the national meeting from happening before any more federal money, they said, could be wasted on this outrageous thing. But Congress went ahead and, did not do anything to try to stop it from happening. And so the question was, well, what do the conservatives do then? And Lottie Beth Hobbs had the idea of reserving the Astrodome and filling it with protesters, with their own speakers.
Lottie Beth Hobbs, by the way, is an unsung character in this story who I wish I had more time to cover. She was the founder of Women Who Want to Be Women, another anti-ERA group. She was a member of the Church of Christ, a popular speaker in Christian women's conferences, and author of 8 books. Notably, Church of Christ members at the time were not supposed to be involved in politics. But again, nothing in this season moves in a straight line. The Church of Christ occupied a substantial portion of the anti-ERA squad. In Texas, they were 57% of the movement, compared to Baptists in the state who were just 9.2%.
Phyllis Schlafly said, we couldn't possibly get that many to come at this late date. It's the weekend right before Thanksgiving. All the hotel rooms in the city are booked. And then if we did this and we had a poor turnout, it would make us look weak. And Lottie Beth Hobbs said, no, we can do this and we're going to do this. And by the way, she was working closely with another woman named Nellie Gray, who was the creator of the organization March for Life.
A pro-life march that started out small but was growing every year.
Which held the march every year on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And Nellie Gray and Lottie Beth Hobbs really did the work in organizing what they call the pro-life, pro-family rally on Saturday afternoon during the National Women's Conference.
If we can't beat them and we can't join them, then we'll do our own thing. They also assembled their own sort of bizarro national plan of action, a petition with 4 planks that was circulated around the country calling for a right to life amendment, one that opposed federally funded preschool, another that opposed the ERA, a motion against the right of gay and lesbians to adopt children and teach in public schools. Schlafly was now on board and made speeches to promote the event. They placed an ad in Houston newspapers featuring a blonde girl taking First Communion. The caption read, "Mommy, when can I grow up to be a lesbian?"
They denounced this whole National Women's Conference and show that it did not speak for them. You heavily publicized this with the aid of church groups and conservative patriotic groups, and they ended up getting, some people said 10,000, others said 15,000 to this rally.
This rally, unlike the national one, was funded by individuals who attended, some of them saying that it would mean fewer Christmas presents for the kids, but in their minds, it was worth it to support the cause.
In chartered buses and cars and, came from all over the country to turn up for this one afternoon rally that was far more successful, actually, than even the organizers had hoped.
Organizers distributed songs that could be sung and games that could be played on the long bus trip. The National Conference required an incredible amount of hotel rooms, so there were none left by the time the pro-life, pro-family movement was organized. It had to be a one-day event. Plus, this would allow enough time for people to get back home for church on Sunday. They denied the Christian Defense League the right to distribute literature. Remember, they were the group outside the National Conference that called whites the chosen people of God.
And the press described this as having both religious and political overtones, that it seemed almost as much like a religious revival as a political rally.
This conference was filled with people of different faith traditions, various Protestant denominations, Catholics, Jews, and Mormons, though it was not racially diverse. A sociologist studying the event on the day counted just 3 black people in the crowd, though 2 more were welcomed as speakers. The whole event was just 3 hours long.
Featured speakers, that was conservative celebrities that, aside from Schlafly, were little known outside conservative circles, but well known to this crowd.
The opening prayer was offered by Paige Patterson, president of Criswell Seminary. The American flag and state flags were paraded. Attendees commented on the swell of emotion felt by being surrounded by so many like-minded conservatives, not unlike the feelings that overtook women of the National Conference.
One of the conservatives that addressed the crowd, of course, was Lottie Beth Hobbs, the organizer of the rally. Nellie Gray, the founder of March for Life, spoke.
Here's an actor reading selections from her speech.
I actually weep that we have to have a rally such as this in America.
And later,
women libbers are trying to dress up abortion, but no matter how you dress it up, it comes down to killing a baby.
This coming years before groups like the Southern Baptist Convention would pass resolutions against abortion. Dr. Mildred Jefferson was one of the African American speakers, and she held people spellbound.
She had been the first African American to graduate from Harvard Medical School, and she was there because she was president of the National Right to Life Committee, and the National Right to Life Committee had become an ally of Phyllis Schlafly and the anti-ERA movement during these state meetings.
Anita Bryant sent a pre-recorded message. Also speaking were Elizabeth Elliot, famous missionary and writer, and a man who left his homosexual lifestyle. Speakers went to great pains to position religious people as the majority opinion in the United States.
And another one was a guy named Clay Smothers, a very curious fellow. He was an African American who was a state representative, a state legislator from Dallas. He had been, I was shocked to find, a George Wallace delegate to the Democratic National Convention back in 1972.
George Wallace being the racist former governor of Alabama, the governor of the song Sweet Home Alabama.
So he got up there and just thrilled the crowd, getting some of the loudest cheers of all, calling for, quote, a victory over the perverts in this country, unquote, saying he had enough civil rights to fill a hungry goat, but wanted the right to segregate himself and his family from these misfits and perverts. And like a lot of other people, were roundly criticizing the fact that the First Lady of the nation, as well as 2 former First Ladies from both parties, had gone over there and stood up on the stage with Bella Abzug and all of these murderers, baby killers, and perverts. And this was the kind of language that was there, in addition to, just real angst about the fact that the federal government had been paying for all of this.
There's a lot to unpack there. Jimmy Carter had done quite a bit to distance himself from the radical parts of the National Women's Conference, something, again, that his predecessors had called for, including Republican Gerald Ford. But Rosalind Carter's presence across town was not lost on the conservatives. President Carter, an evangelical, was losing his bona fides with the religious right.
Schlafly, when she then addressed the crowd, attacked the feminists again, as she did regularly, saying that the real goal of the feminists was, to drive the homemaker out of the home, to forbid women to identify as traditional wives and mothers. And she said, American women do not want the ERA. They don't want abortion, lesbian rights, or child care in the hands of the government, and just, denounced the whole International Women's Year program, as well as the National Women's Conference across town as this costly mistake at taxpayers' expense. But the result of all of this was that they were thrilled to look around and see one another. And Schlafly played up to that, saying, if we all just stay together and we continue to be politically active, we're going to win, insisting to them that they had someone on their side that was far more powerful than the President of the United States, meaning God Almighty.
After just a few hours, they boarded their buses and headed home, fanning throughout the country with a sense that religious people could work together, even those of different religions. The Phyllis Schlafly report that came out the following month reported that the National Women's Conference voting had been rigged, and supplied no evidence to that effect. It said that the National Plan of Action had been a foregone conclusion and that the vote count was predetermined. Again, no evidence. They had been telling themselves over and over again that they were the majority opinion. So how could votes like that happen? Of course, logic would tell you that conservative women hadn't been nominated in the states, and others didn't attend, instead opting for the pro-family movement. The newsletter weirdly didn't seem to understand that if you don't show up for a vote, your opinion doesn't get counted. Mirroring that old fundamentalist dilemma, how can you complain about a society that doesn't reflect your values when you don't take part in the society? They did manage to submit a minority report, a conservative platform like the National Plan of Action, to be given to the Congress and to the president. Then the dust settled. Women from both sides went home, back to life, jobs, family responsibilities. As for the feminists,
they were very excited about that National Plan of Action, and they presented it to Carter in this amazing White House ceremony. And a lot of changes across the country did take place, including at the state level.
But feminists were disappointed that it didn't do more than it did. Really, how could it? The amount of toes that were stepped on to get the document written, the conferences convened, counterattacks on the conservatives, the National Plan of Action was, politically, radioactive.
Carter's administration, one of the things they did was to just list all the different things that they felt like they had already done and accomplished. And that's true, they were trying really hard, and he had a record number of appointments of women and minorities to judicial positions and to positions in his cabinet, and did work hard for the Equal Rights Amendment.
He even backed a 3-year extension of the ERA ratification deadline, bumping it to 1982. Though, in the long run, it didn't help.
Also, there was basically an economic downturn at that point, and Carter himself was a fiscal conservative, and that did not leave much room for the kind of expanded federal programs that had been recommended in the National Plan of Action.
Then there were some issues within the President's Commission for Women.
When they criticized Carter publicly for not doing more, he fired Bala Abzug as head of the committee, and most of them resigned in protest, and it made her a real feminist martyr. Feminists after that who were Democrats were very divided among themselves about whether or not to support Carter even for his re-election.
Meaning that conservatives were angry at President Carter for a conference that wasn't his idea. And the feminists were upset at him because they said he didn't do enough. A situation that Carter often found himself in, Too moderate for the loudest people on the left and the right.
Some of them, including Abzug, backed Ted Kennedy when he challenged Carter.
An unlikely decision considering Kennedy's suspicious behavior around the death of a woman. In the 1980 Democratic National Convention, the feminists managed to get many of their recommendations into the party platform, including gay rights and abortion.
One of their goals really through the National Women's Conference had been to kind of merge all of these things into a very strong, human rights movement through the Democratic Party. But a lot of the critics in the party of theirs thought that it saddled Carter with a platform that was more radical, certainly than he would have liked. And when he was defeated, Hamilton Jordan, cruelly, I think, said that feminists had gotten in Ronald Reagan exactly what they deserved. Ouch.
In a lot of instances, President Carter couldn't win for losing. I'll cover that in a future episode. But as Carter was experiencing pushback, conservative women on the far right were coming into their own.
There's a huge change happening. The Republican feminists like Jill Ruckelshaus and others are horrified to see their party shifting to the right as new right politicians who are seeking to build an enduring, successful conservative movement begin to focus their sights on the Republican Party and begin to emulate the methods that the conservative women had shown to be successful in politicizing and uniting social conservatives.
It went by kind of fast there, but Marjorie mentioned a group called the New Right. They learned tactics by watching what conservative women did in opposition to the IWY. It was this group of guys who used bulk mailing and strange new economic ideas to disrupt public discourse and get their way. As one guy said, we organize discontent. Discontent to rally their followers the same way that Phyllis Schlafly, Lottie Beth Hobbs, and others had in trying to disrupt the National Women's Conference. Creating both a sense of us being the other, but also the majority. Having the moral high ground, but also being looked down upon. We don't need the media, but look how unfairly they treat us. Let's pull our kids out of public schools and then complain how there are no religious people there. Create discontent to force your political objectives. Use direct mail to subvert traditional forms of media so that you can't be fact-checked. Identify real concerns, and then use whatever tactic necessary to counter them, even if it involves being unable to substantiate your conspiracy theories. And yes, their predictions sometimes came true.
I believe that it was Schlafly and the conservative women who showed them the way, and that the origins of the religious right, which of course we're speaking of this alliance of conservative religious groups that first became very obvious in the late 70s, that the origins of this was in the organizing for the state IWI meetings and in the success of the pro-life, pro-family rally, which had demonstrated to the conservatives their own strength and numbers.
Republican women worked hard to get Ronald Reagan nominated. A month before his presidential election, they assembled the Reagan Campaign Family Policy Advisory Board with a lot of familiar names. From author Beverly LaHaye, whose husband would go on to write the influential Left Behind series, to Lottie Beth Hobbs. Their goal? To establish traditional family values via the White House.
And the GOP in 1980 dropped its 40-year record of support for the Equal Rights Amendment and adopted a very strong pro-life position that the party has held ever since.
Reagan supported pro-family conservative women.
But at the same time, he didn't want to antagonize and mobilize feminists any more than he already had. He also had a daughter, Maureen Reagan, who was a big supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment and tried hard to persuade him not to go against it, to no avail.
After the conference in Houston, there were a lot of materials left over. There had been booths and classes hosted by every kind of organization, including religious groups and pro-lifers, the YWCA to NASA. But there were also remnants left behind from lesbian and Marxist groups. Members of Schlafly's Eagle Forum from Oklahoma gathered boxes of offensive material and created a display on 60 pieces of poster board, objects that one feminist claimed had been supplemented by a visit to an adult store. Needless to say, it was pretty graphic. Said one person who saw it,
There was a chair down there at the end, and sometimes they just had to sit down and catch their breath.
The display went on tour, confirming that, indeed, alternative lifestyles and political ideologies had been promoted. In a turn that I find interesting, Schlafly did not find a position in the Reagan campaign or White House. She was simply too risky. But she continued working out of her mansion, writing, speaking, and organizing, and would eventually be eulogized by then-candidate Donald Trump. She warned that
the women's lib movement sealed its own doom by deliberately hanging around its neck the albatross of abortion, lesbianism, pornography, and federal control.
One of her followers said that the 26 resolutions passed at the National Conference were the best recruiting tool she ever had. All she had to do was read them out loud. This conference, this one weekend, means so many different things. As we heard at the top of the show, it was a chance for women of all kinds to assemble and express their interests. Women got the chills as minorities were recognized and their rights were affirmed. But it was also a time when those on the far right felt shut out. And then they used what would sometimes be kind of petty tactics to disrupt what they couldn't control. It also meant the bonding of the religious right in a way that Harold Ockenga and Billy Graham couldn't do in the 1950s. The outcome is that it opened up room for women to rise to prominence on all sides of the arguments. It welded together the interests of the pro-family and pro-life movements with those of religious people. It set the agenda for feminism for decades to come. It put the ERA on display and then sealed its gradual repeal and decline into obscurity. Who did all of this? Largely women. The unsung players in the discussion about what bonded evangelicals to the Republican Party. Women like Phyllis Schlafly and Lottie Beth Hobbs are no longer household names, but their legacy lives on. They bonded disparate forces. All that was missing was for someone to take this mishmash of people and turn them into a voting bloc. Someone with access to money, fringe religious ideas, bulk mailing, improbable economic concerns, and fear over forced busing in public schools. The stage was set for the new right, and as the National Women's Conference was being disassembled, these political actors were already on the move. Special thanks to Marjorie Spruill. She spoke with me for a full 2 hours and was so kind. I cannot recommend her book enough. It's called Divided We Stand, and it's a fair and readable resource. You can find a full list of sources on the website at trucepodcast.com. And while you're there, consider giving a little bit to help me continue making this show. This is largely a one-man operation, and it took months to make this 3-part miniseries. From reading books and taking notes to listening to audio archives, searching through old news reports, writing a script, recording it, and editing it. This show takes a lot of time. What other Christian podcast is talking about the National Women's Conference? If you like fair, accessible, historic material, support the Truce Podcast on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Patrons of the show can even get access to bonus materials, like more of my interview with Marjorie. That's at patreon.com/trucepodcast. And on Venmo, I'm at Truce Podcast. Special thanks to the people who gave me their voices for this episode, including Amy Fritz of the Untangled Faith podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Starrand, and this is Truce. This episode is brought to you by the Compelled Podcast. What would you do if you came face to face with a murderer sent to kill you for being a Christian? For Virginia Prodan, that question isn't hypothetical. Virginia was a small, petite attorney defending Christians in court in communist Romania. And she was really good. So good, in fact, she caught the attention of the communist regime. One day, a tall, muscular man walked into her office, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down. I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next would surprise both of them. Listen to Virginia's entire story on the Compelled Podcast, where they find incredible true-life stories of God working through the lives of normal people. Virginia is on episode number 31, which is titled, He Came to Kill Me. Listen on your podcasting app or at compelledpodcast.com.